today we are talking about women in the Revolutionary War, and this is a big subject. Normally when I lecture on just the Revolutionary War within United States history, like a U.S. history class, it's a week and a half to 2 weeks worth of lecture. And like an online class, it's like 3 parts. So there's a lot here. And even with women, if we're focusing just on women, there's a lot. So I want to make sure that I don't have this go excessive and try to keep it with my normal long length as it is, which are always longer than I want them to be. But I'm going to go for that length as my goal. So there are going to be some parts I skip over that are kind of the more detailed background of it that don't necessarily include women, and make sure that it's hyper-focused on what women were doing. However, I do have to at least provide a little bit of setup, which is not, I'm going to just be very brief with. So like I said, normally I would talk in detail about these things and for like a U.S. history class and talk about how all of that led up to the taxations. I'm not going to talk about all the taxations, and like I'm going to skip the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party because women were relatively not involved with those particular acts. But we are going to talk about a few of the taxes that were really important and that women were directly involved with. So if we look at just, let's say, the background again of how the troubles starts brewing between the British and the colonists, is that you have a series of, we'll just say, it's European wars, but it's also European wars that lead to war in the colonies. So that's part of the importance of it. So I'm just going to kind of list these and break down which ones included the colonies and which ones didn't. So you had the 9 Years' War, and then after the 9 Years' War, you have the War of Spanish Succession. And I'll explain why this is significant and why I didn't want to at least leave out the list, even if we're not getting into the detail of each of these wars. The War of Jenkins' Ear, and yes, it's a person who had his ear cut off. And then the most relevant, the 7 Years' War. Okay, so the 9 Years' War, War of Spanish Succession, did not involve the colonies. But they are important because it put the British into these. The British were involved in all of these wars. Did not involve colonies. And then the War of Jenkins' Ear did involve some, but not. Some colonies, but not in the Americas. So not on the mainland, right? And then the 7 Years' War was fought in the colonies. So why is this important? Well, one, what it does is it shows us the transition. Well, one, it shows us the transition of the landscape of war taking more and more place within the colonies. The colonies were becoming an ever-present and important component in European power, and the warfare was beginning to shift to those locations. So that the colonists were going to, the colonists could, with the 9 Years' War and the War of Spanish Succession, be like, that's not our problem. Kind of like what the U.S. does later with World War II and World War I and World War II. That's over there. That's not our problem. Well, the colonists can kind of do that too. They didn't experience the war. They don't really experience the hardships of it or the economic cost. So that one, let's say, we'll say significance here, right? Because that way we list all of them. Struggling to write. There we go. All right. So one, the shift to colonies in war. The second is going to be the economic hardship. Now, there's two parts to this. First, with the British specifically and how they experience the hardship, and then second is going to be how it's experienced in the colonies. So you have that importance, the importance of the colonies in war, and then you have an economic hardship component. England, the British were in all four of these wars, and it's expensive, and they had taxed the people in England a lot. So to be fair to them, when they start taxing the colonies, they saw it as only the natural next step, and kind of saying, hey, we've already taxed the crap out of everyone here. Your next, plus the 7 Years' War was fought in the colonies. And so then, of course, their argument became, we fought for you in the 7 Years' War, and you're welcome, and you could show a little gratitude by paying some taxes. Now, the colonies did pay taxes, but the way that they paid taxes was, as far as it was very much hands off, and not direct taxes. So essentially, like, you owe taxes, but your local governments get to figure out what those taxes are going to be. And this worked because the idea was that the local governments, they knew what taxes the people would be willing to pay, what people could afford, what different things would work. And as long as the taxes got paid, does it matter? But the British, with the ever-increasing pressure of the economic hardship that these mini wars had created, began to look to directly tax, with disastrous effects we will see, the colonies. And then the other thing that was evident from the 7 Years' War on was tensions and, let's say, division between the British and the colonists, because technically they're both British, but there was a clear difference happening that was beginning to distinguish between the colonists seeing themselves as other than British, and the British seeing themselves as British, and the colonist as not. And then there was a bit of snobbery there. Those British, we were bitter. The colonist, it was, you guys are stuck up and screw you kind of thing. And that was kind of what that we saw that with in Spain and other places. Being born in the original mother country was a higher status than being born in the colonies, even though they were supposed to be an extension of the actual mother country. So the colonies that were British were supposed to be an extension of Britain, but in reality, the way that the people were treated, not so much the case. And you had then the other thing that happened with this, although we could put it under tensions, is that you had British soldiers remain in the colonies. And they were there to fight the 7 Years' War, and then were left for a variety of reasons. That increases the tensions. And then, of course, taxation. And that's going to be the whole taxation without representation. But they did the taxation because of the extreme debt and feeling that the colonies should pay some of that cost because they fought to protect them. And the colonists argued we only had to fight because of your interest in Europe. Look at the past wars and all that happened that way. And so while they were allies during the war, after the war around mid-1760s, like I said, you have these tensions of seeing the British seeing the colonists as inferior, the tensions of the soldiers being present. And like I said, so that's why those wars are important to mention, because it is a catalyst, a domino effect over a long period of time that is moving towards what then comes up with the taxation. All right, so that's all the background I'm going to give you. It's a lot shorter than it normally is. All right, so I'm trying to be good there with that. So taxation. So there's a couple different structures. And there, of course, the rallying cry is taxation. Well, the argument is that the British are going to do, we'll just write it, taxation without representation. When the British, when the king starts implementing these taxes, or the British really leaders start implementing the taxes, the colonists cry foul and say, hey, you're taxing us without representation, and that's not legal. The British said that they did have representation. They had virtual representation. Virtual representation was essentially that a member of parliament represented both the colonist and their district. So they said, no, we're giving you representation. See, we assigned this person to be your representative. And they're like, wait, but they live in England and they already have a district. And they're like, yeah, but they're just taking on yours as well. And they're like, that's not representation. That's crap representation. We need someone that represents from here, that actually knows what's going on, someone that lives here and knows what the issues are. And that was a fundamental disagreement between the British and the colonists. The first tax that the British implemented was the Sugar Act. The Sugar Act was based on molasses tax for sugar. And it's interesting because it actually lowered the cost of the tax. So we'll just say lowered the tax. It lowered the cost of molasses because they lowered the tax. It reduced it, but they made it more difficult, made it harder to smuggle, which doesn't inherently sound like a bad thing. There were harsher punishments. Well, why this would be problematic for people was because essentially they had been avoiding the higher sugar tax. The merchants had been avoiding the higher sugar taxes by smuggling and going through black markets and avoiding that. So this Sugar Act essentially made that significantly harder to do, which meant they would be paying more than what they were paying when they were avoiding the tax. But technically, the tax was lower. The thing with this is that this didn't get a lot of interest. You do have the Sons of Liberty that show up and they start protesting. Women don't get involved yet. They're going to get involved with the next act. But this is important because it was the first example of direct taxation, right? Where the British government was like, okay, we're going to, here's the tax we're creating. We're not going to give you a choice. You don't get a pick. This is just the tax. Most not surprising, merchants were the number one people who protested besides the Sons of Liberty. So again, not a lot of traction, but it is important as the first one that they're doing. The one that actually gets a ton of attention was the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is again this direct one, and that's what the colonists are going to protest. We'll talk about why this gets more traction. So it was a tax on all printed materials produced in the colonies. And it actually was an embossed stamp, which is why it gets called the Stamp Act. So they would, and this includes a bunch of, let me say what it includes and then I'll explain how it looked. So this could be newspapers, stationery, a deck of cards, posters, books, right? I mean, anything you could think of that's printed, court documents, marriage certificates or licenses, land ownership, deeds and transfers, sell, buy, all of that, right? Any kind of economic or commercial document. Okay, and there's lots more. This just gives you a sense of some of them. Now, there's two kind of lines here, right? This one here. Oh, and that's okay. The stamp. It was an embossed stamp on it, and they actually had like a statement that said, like, it's illegal to purchase any printed materials that doesn't have the Stamp Act, and the embossed stamp proved that that printed material had paid the tax, and it said what the fine was and stuff on it. And so these ones, though, the newspaper, stationeries, cards, posters, books, etc., right? Who cares, right? If you bought a black market version that didn't have it, right? This was easy to avoid the stamp tax. And if it was just those things, it probably would have been less of an issue because it was an easy way to circumvent it. Because they didn't go around hunting down who had a deck of cards in their house that didn't have the stamp on it. But these other documents here, right, these were largely legal documents. And the significance of this is that without the stamp tax, then they were not valid. And so, of course, that could cause a lot of problems for legal documents. This was immediately disliked, and you end up having protests. So why does the Stamp Act get more traction than the Sugar Act? Well, because it was on everything, one. Right, so it was much more widespread. The Sugar Act affected merchants, but the average person didn't feel or really notice that impact. And the merchants weren't as good as printers as getting the word out. So essentially, like, the printing press and the printers are like Twitter today. Essentially, don't piss off the printers because they're going to go to their printing press and print a whole bunch of posters without the stamp tax, complaining about the British and direct taxation, which is what they did. And they got the word out. Plus, for women, these are things they purchase. Maybe not as much the legal documents, but all of those other things they would purchase on a regular basis. And so it impacted them more. The Sugar Act, it could have if they had noticed a difference in price, but they didn't. But with the Stamp Act, it was so inclusive that women would have been aware that the things that they purchase were now having a higher price, and that stamp embossed act was like right in your face too, so you couldn't miss it. And then it helped that the printers were pissed and they printed a whole bunch of stuff. So from almost the beginning, women get involved as soon as the other colonies get involved. So yeah, technically the Sons of Liberty started a little bit sooner, but they were always a little more of the radical side of the group. They're going to be the first to suggest breaking from the British and forming their own government and system. Even when most of the colonists were like, we just want to protest this and have them change it. We don't really want to break from them. The Sons of Liberties were way ahead in that department. But from the Stamp Act on, women were directly involved in the beginnings of the Revolutionary War. So right, even before we get to the actual war, women were involved in the early dealings of that. And they were involved in the protests. They created the counterpart to the Sons of Liberty, which was the Daughters of Liberty. And they were, the Daughters of Liberty were looking to actively protest what they saw as colonial interference, and women wanted to be involved, and so they really did see themselves as the counterpart to the Sons of Liberty. what the Daughters of Liberty did with the Stamp Act protest is really pretty much the same thing as the men. They made posters, and they had protests where they marched and protested around British officials. So there were the governor and some other British officials, and they went into those in town and held up signs and posters and marched and protested the direct taxation. They did actually start early too, writing about the political issues of taxation. And these were twofold. One, they were passed around to other women. They held meetings. That's where they were mostly passed around for women to explain what was going on and why this impacted them and why you should care. And then they also started writing for the newspaper. Some of the earliest were where they took a male name so that people would take them seriously. As protest and these taxations continued, eventually they'd come under women's names and they stopped caring. But early on within this phase, it was largely under a male name. So the protests, there's more formal resolutions. The Virginia created their own resolution to send to the king, but the protests and demonstrations were important, and women were in there involved from the start, and it was effective because what actually happens, the consequences of the protests. Were that the British repealed the Stamp Act, and this is important because what's going to happen is the British are going to keep flip-flopping. They're going to be like, oh, we can do this, and then okay, fine, your protest, we'll take it away. However, when they repealed the Stamp Act, they did create what was called the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act basically said, it's kind of like a tantrum. What it essentially, this is in my words, but this is basically what it was saying. We are repealing this because we wanted to, not because of your protests. So like, you didn't have anything to do with this. It had nothing to do with the protest at all. We just decided we wanted to do this. And more importantly, we reserve the right to impose taxes whenever we want. So they did want to say that so that they could say, like, just because we're doing this doesn't mean that we don't have the right to do direct taxation. We're not conceding to that. So this was a more important thing. And I mean, they show it because they're going to have more taxes not too long after this. But it was kind of like a little like, fine. But just so you know, it had nothing to do with what you did. It was totally all just because we felt like it. And you had no influence whatsoever. And we totally can impose taxes whenever we want. So just shut up about you won, blah, blah, blah. It's basically what this formal statement was saying. There's a little bit of time in between. And then you have another tax that is imposed. And this is the Townshend Act. Now, this one, this one is really partly the colonists' fault, because with the Stamp Act protest, they focused on direct tax. And so the Stamp Act, and this was both for men and women in the language that they use, okay? In the Stamp Act protest, both men and women, the language that they used was direct taxes equals no, but trade and regulation were okay with. Because, I mean, I don't know, whether they really were thinking that far in advance or whether it was just the language they were trying to focus on, because the Stamp Act was a direct tax on colonial goods. And so there was sentiment made that trade and regulation stuff, taxes would be okay, because that's not direct tax on colonial goods. So the Townshend Act then focused on that. They said, okay, fine. We won't do direct tax on colonial goods that are in the colonies. Instead, we'll focus on creating a new tax on imported goods. More like the Sugar Act. Right? And so, okay, so that's what we'll do. And this was glass, paint, oil, lead, and the one that's going to be a big stickler, tea. And the other thing that they did that was important with this is that they really thought that by creating this caveat that the colonists would be okay. So to be fair to the British, they created this tax based on what the colonists told them, and then really tried hard to make it acceptable to the colonists. But the reality was the colonists were just not going to be okay with any taxes that the British came up with, no matter where or how or why they were imposed. So the other thing that they said is that the money made from these taxes, these trade and regulation taxes, right, would go to help pay for the colonial administration positions. So they're like, look, we're not going to keep the money. It's going to positions within the colonies. So that's good, right? Jobs, and we're not keeping the money. The money was not going back to England. They thought that this would be okay, and it was not. This leads to, I'm trying to think, I'm going to put it under a separate thing. Because of the Townshend Acts, you get where women were most involved in directly changing the outcome of that situation. Like I said, they'd already been involved, but it was the Daughters of Liberty, and it still was a relatively smaller group of women. After the Townshend Act, women in the colonies, especially in the northern colonies, the southern colonies we'll talk about in a minute were a little bit different, but the northern colonies were super involved after this point. So they decided, like, okay, fine, they want to keep doing these taxes, we're going to boycott all British goods. So that was the decision to boycott all British goods. The issue with this is this requires women's participation. You cannot successfully do this if you don't have women helping with this. And the reason, because a lot of, women were responsible for the domestic sphere and cooking, cleaning, purchasing clothes, making clothes, doing all of that. This was going to impact them the most. The men could go ahead and say, we're going to boycott all British goods, but if the women said, yeah, no, I'm not, it wouldn't have worked, because the women were the ones that were going to have to make up for everything they were boycotting. Women had to... and so what I mean, make up for all the boycotted goods is that they were going to have to make them themselves. They were going to have to make them, right? So this means, like, you want clothing, right? You're going to have to spin and weave that again. Now, we saw with A Midwife's Tale, right? You had the loom and the homespun goods. By the mid-1700s, unless you were moving further west, which every time you move west, it kind of like you start living like early colonial period until enough people move. If you were living on the East Coast, you were purchasing stuff from merchants and stores because so much goods were being imported. Women weren't learning even how to spin and do the loom and weave anymore. And so that was a big thing. You had to give up tea. You had to give up a lot of easy goods that made life easier because you could just go buy them, right? Again, we mentioned this, right? Think about the ability to just go purchase your own goods. It's so much easier if you can just buy it versus thinking about all the steps you need to make it by hand and at home. And so women were going to be the ones that had to make them. And if they had to be on board to do this, and they definitely were. It created because this is going to be, there was a huge focus on homespun goods and rejecting all of that. They even had you make all this stuff locally. They even had that it'd be better that they were willing to have the sacrifice of giving up tea and sacrifice to drink coffee in order to fulfill this. And that was the statement that you think about where we switched to a more coffee-based system than tea. This was kind of the start of it. Everyone drank tea back then. And everyone gave up tea for this. And so they looked to coffee as the alternative while they weren't drinking tea. And then coffee eventually kind of sticks in that process. So women created what were called spinning bees. Spinning bees were a way to essentially deal with the homespun goods and be successful with that. They women who still had their the spinning wheel, they pulled them out and taught the younger women, because the reality was most of the younger women had not done that anymore. And so because there were a lot of people, the houses weren't large enough to congregate, so they gathered outside on lawns and learned how to spin, thus the spinning bees. But this wasn't the only thing that women did. They didn't just create the homespun goods. During these lessons, they would all, and then eventually move from lessons to just production, right? And so during these, they would discuss the politics of the day and various issues and how it influenced the colonies and how it influenced women and why it was important to women. They actually invited guest speakers to come talk about the political aspects, and then ultimately made their own food and goods, which they had largely purchased up to this point. Women from this very early period became super invested and involved in the political discussion, which, right, it tends to be when you talk about these things, women get left out of this discussion, for regular U.S. history, because this idea that somehow women weren't involved in politics, that's not true at all. Women may not have the right to vote, and they may not have a right to have a position in politics, and yet from the very creation, starting inkling of what becomes the United States, women were entrenched within this discussion, and more importantly, directly influenced the success of the boycotts with the spinning bees. Because the other thing that they did, besides, they continued to protest too, but the other thing that they did is that they encouraged, let's say, the rest of society to follow through with the boycott. Again, if women weren't involved with this, the boycott would have never worked, because boycotts only work when you have enough people stopping something to create a significant economic impact that basically gets the attention of whoever you're boycotting, and is long enough that they realize that they have to make concessions because they can't keep going. Most boycotts fail because you don't have enough people and it doesn't go for a long enough time. You really do need a collective group of people, a large collective group of people, all to do the same thing. And that's really hard to do. A little bit easier in the Revolutionary War time period because there was less of a population. But throughout history, when you look at boycotts, very few actually work long term because it doesn't make a big enough dent. Or you do they did like 10 years ago, I don't know now, a while ago, they did a boycott on gas. And they're like, boycott gas for the day. That's one day is never going to work. People just, even people who decided to participate in it just bought gas the day before, the day after. And plenty of people were like, well, I still got to get to work, I'm buying gas. So it did nothing, right? You've got to have an all-in kind of situation. And women became the gatekeepers of this all-in situation, if you will. They did a couple of things. They encouraged, we'll assume all of them are encouraged under this. They had they worked with the merchants to purchase and sell local goods, right? So women are making all of these homespun, they weren't all spun, but that's what they just called them, homespun goods, which was candles, candles, bread, soap, butter, clothing. And they said, right, instead of keeping the British goods that we're not going to buy and you're going to lose money, buy our local goods and sell them to people, because not everyone can make all of these things. So you have different women making different things that they're good at, sell them to the merchants, and then the merchants can sell them to the other women and people that aren't making that particular product, which is a good idea. The other thing that they did is that they kept the men in line. The men actually started to try to give in to the boycott and start purchasing British goods, whereas the women never did. And so they actually did a couple of things. They blocked access to merchants who tried to bypass the boycott. So if a merchant was like, screw that, I'm still gonna bring in and sell British goods behind the back alley, they found out who was doing that, and then they would go block the store, sometimes blocking the merchant, but block the store so no one could get in and out. And then that way he couldn't sell whatever British goods that he had. They actually physically stopped men who tried to go into merchant stores and purchase, tried to break the boycott. But they actively stopped men from going into the merchant stores who were trying to buy British goods. And then they also tried to encourage the rest of society through this by writing newspaper articles. And what they did with these is a couple different things. They had a competition, and they would record who made the most homespun goods, and they kept a running tally, and publicly praised mostly women, but some men too, who did the most homespun goods. And so it was in the public's view of like, oh, look, our neighbors made a ton and we're not on the list, and so peer pressure. They also wrote articles on why the boycott was necessary, and as well as like their personal feelings on the politics. So that was on why the boycott. They also wrote articles, just like with the Stamp Act, on politics and the colonial future. If they had not done these things, there's no way, like I said, that the boycotts would have been successful. women were essential to that, and they didn't just say, okay, fine, we won't buy British goods. They took it. They were active participants in the boycotts, and by far the most important participants in the boycott. And then on top of it, made sure the rest of the colonial society followed the boycott. So this is a huge pre-Revolutionary War component of how women were involved in the political realm. And it's because of the boycotts that the Townshend Acts got repealed, except for the Tea Act, which impacts later, which we're not going to talk about, but the Boston Tea Party and all of that. The boycotts were successful, and the British ended up repealing the Townshend Acts because of the boycotts. And so you can certainly argue that led to women being one step further to helping the colonies be one step further to becoming independent. Now, I mentioned I was going to talk about North versus the South and women that way. So we're going to put that as 7 here because it's still with the spinning bees. Actually, let's do D. It's with the boycotts, not so much the spinning bees. So what we talked about with the spinning bees, with the articles, with the physically stopping men, that was the northern women. Southern women were never as involved as women in the North. And there's reasons for this, also with women's rights later and everything else. It kind of is the thing that happens with that, right? So by this point, you have this South that had shifted to slavery as a slave society. The Southern plantation women, the wives of plantation owners, they weren't the ones that produced homespun goods. Slaves produced all of the goods, but that they didn't purchase in Southern society. And on top of that, it was seen in the South as women and labor for the wealthy and elite was seen as bad because, of course, it was connected to the idea of slavery. In fact, one of the things, and we'll talk about this in more detail when we talk about Southern society and slavery, the whole argument actually became that the reason white women, plantation mistresses, the wives of these plantation owners, the elite, were liberated from the drudges of labor was because of slaves. And thus women could be put up on a pedestal and honored for just being and virtuous, and their focus became on being virtuous and simply just being. Women in the South, the elite, okay, that's not going to include the poor white Southerners, and of course it's not including the slaves. The elite white women, who were the ones that were targeted for promoting the boycott and stuff, to work was bad. Women in the South of this elite group, they did not work. Everything was done by slaves. The whole point was that women didn't have to work, and it was they turned their noses down on any women who were interested in doing work. So to produce homespun goods, that was work. So what they did do is they did have slaves produce goods to show support. But that's not the same thing as you actually actively participating in it. And the fervor and emphasis on the connecting to the political, right? They never connected to the political aspect. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, of course, was because they didn't do the work. you didn't get that spirit of that you were doing something important. The other thing is that the South was even more patriarchal than the North. And so there was very much, just like that, the idea that women in the South were looking down upon working. Women were definitely not supposed to be part of the politics. That was not. It was very much women were involved in managing the household slaves, getting married, and giving birth. They didn't even raise their children. The slaves did. And outside of that, you were not to be involved in the rest. The political, the economic world was for men. And while that was true in the North to a degree, not like in the South. So there you had a much more strict patriarchal hierarchy that then women didn't get involved in that. Oh, that's not womanly. That's not what we do. And because so much of what was a womanly virtue was emphasized in the South for these women, I mean, it was hammered into you from a young age. So it's not surprising that they looked at that and were like, that's not our realm. And then on top of that, because they're not producing the goods, you don't get that excitement and fervor that the women in the North did. So there was already at this point, even before the Revolutionary War, a growing divide between the North and South, and the growing divide between women in the North and the South and their roles and function and how they lived their lives. And it really just became a widening gap as time went on. But even how they experienced the war, in the Revolutionary War, there's some differences. Definitely their involvement. Again, all the stuff that I'm going to talk about here with involvement in the Revolutionary War is almost exclusively going to be women in the North. Women in the South did just a very little bit. Because just the expectations and roles of women in that structure. We're going to look at this structure more clearly again when we talk about slavery in the South and Southern society. So I don't want to get too far into it here. Just to know that it's directly related to slavery and directly related to the strict patriarchal hierarchy that was established by the elite, the plantation elite, for roles of women. Okay, so that's the difference there. So you have this involvement. So where we're going to skip ahead, where we're not going to talk too much about, there were a few other taxes. There was the Intolerable Acts. First there was the Boston Massacre, Boston Tea Party, then the Intolerable Acts. This eventually leads to delegations and the Continental Congress, which eventually leads to the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is important. We're going to look at the Declaration of Independence. I thought about whether I talked about it now. I'm just going to mention one part. We're going to compare and contrast it when we look at the Seneca Falls Convention with the Civil War, because the women use it and reference it when they are declaring what their rights should be. So the Declaration of Independence became something that was super important in terms of language and style. It's actually used, slave men and women actually used it and referenced that language in that as well. So it gets used over and over again and just adapted to say, you're talking about liberty and freedom and equality, and yet we're not included, right? Because it's all men are created equal. We hold all these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. So right there, right in the Declaration of Independence, you have women are left out of that. And then the other key aspect that I'll mention now, and again, we'll talk about it in more detail a little bit later. The Declaration of Independence was important because it set up the Declaration of Independence was the justification for why the colonies were leaving. Right, and so the first part, the preamble, is here's our beliefs. We hold as to be evident all men are created equal, the inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They wanted to do property, but then there was a discussion and a realization that they weren't going to be able to enforce that. So pursuit of happiness. Interesting enough, the French were helped by Thomas Jefferson when they wrote their Declaration of Rights and Rights of Man and Citizen, and they did property. Nonetheless, there was a lot of Enlightenment thinking with inalienable rights. The fact that there was a belief in inalienable rights comes from the Enlightenment period. But it's the idea, what they said, and this is from John Locke specifically, who is also an Enlightenment person. They said that the governments are formed with the consent of the governed. And that's important, right? The government's power is derived from the consent of the governed. So the government only has power, the king only has power, because the governed consent to it. That was revolutionary in of itself, because up to this point, and there were arguments for both. The king was always argued, king and queens were argued to have religious authority, God-given authority by birth to rule. And the Enlightenment thinking that started in Europe, but also had come into the Americas, was that no, they're allowed to govern because the governed agree to it. And so the Declaration of Independence said, we believe, they didn't say we believe, but basically what it's saying is we believe that the government's job is to protect the inalienable rights. If the government fails at those inalienable rights, then it is the obligation of the governed to overthrow them and replace them with a government that will. So here's what's super revolutionary about that preamble, is our Declaration of Independence says we have an obligation, a duty, to overthrow our government if it becomes in opposition of our inalienable rights. And that kind of gets pressed over later and not emphasized, because we do. Our Declaration of Independence essentially says, because remember, they were justifying why they were having a revolution. But our Declaration says that we as citizens of the United States have an obligation and duty to have a rebellion, to have a revolt, if our government is no longer providing the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's, I think, important to remember, is that was in there. Even some of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson was one that said a little revolution now and then is good for the country. And so there were differing views by the founding fathers on that stuff as well. Then the rest of the Declaration of Independence was just a list of why the king sucked. So here's our justification, here's our beliefs and justification for why we're revolting. And then here is a long list of all the ways that the king sucks. And it listed all their grievances, all the ways that they tried to enact change, and all the ways that the king didn't participate in that. So that then is really the defining document that is solidifying that it's not just a little discontent or wanting reform, that nope, now we're saying we're going to break from the British and create our own country, our own government. And that's going to kickstart off the war. So now let's look at women and the war. Okay, so the different periods. Let's say during the war, I guess. So first, let's look at there's a couple different areas in which how women aided the war. Let's do the basic one first, fundraisers. So these were usually done by wealthier women. Because we'll see the different ways that women participated in the war, and the fundraisers tend to be structured towards the wealthier women who, which included Martha Washington and some other very well-known wives of positioned and high in status husbands, and so they well, the other group, camp followers, they actually went with the camps. They didn't. The women that were wealthy didn't have to do this. They could remain at home while their husbands were in high positions in war and still have enough money to not worry about, working at home, taking over their husband's position. So they had the freedom to do this with fundraisers. What they did is that they still wanted to participate. So this was the way that they could do so. So they did in a couple different ways. One was to raise money. Well, that didn't last a long time. There's an interesting story with this that included Martha Washington. So the women got together and they went around to all the houses in the area and asked for funds. And they collected quite a bit of money. They ended up collecting what would allow $2 for each soldier in the Continental Army. So that was a good amount of money. And I mean, especially for that time, I know, $2 doesn't sound like a lot now, but at the time, $2 for every soldier in the Continental Army was a big amount. And so you had Martha Washington and others, and what she did, because she was the wife of George Washington, who was in charge of the Continental Army, is that she told George Washington that's what they wanted, that they wanted to do. So she told George Washington they wanted the money to go directly to the men. The men. So she presented what they had done, the money that they had collected, and he told her no. He said, no, I don't want it to go directly to the men. It should go to him, and he would use it for the soldiers. The reason for this is he claimed they would waste it on booze. And he said basically, if we give the men directly these $2, a lot of them would just use it for booze, and that's just wasting it when we could be using it for more beneficial things. Well, not only Martha Washington, but the other women that had done this fundraiser didn't like that. They didn't like him saying no to them. They didn't like that he was going to take it and do what he wanted with it, because they said, we raised the money. We want it to go for what this particular purpose. So they did not give him the money. They said, fine, we're not going to give you the money. And instead, they shifted it to a warehouse to store for food and clothing. So this was the other two things that the fundraiser did. So the money that they collected then ended up going into this. So they actually bought or rented a warehouse to store goods, and they collected and then what they did is that they used the money to buy food and some goods too. It was mostly food, but they did buy a few goods. Why this was important and why this was needed. So why any of it was needed. The Continental Army, and how the military worked at this point, is that there was not the supply chain. Essentially, in the earlier period, if you were part of the Continental Army, you were given a uniform, but you were expected to bring your own weapon, and then you were expected to pay for everything. You were expected to pay for your own food. You were expected to pay for additional uniforms and clothing. None of that was provided. Like later militaries had their own supply chains and provided for the soldiers. But during the Revolutionary War, the Continental Army, they had to do that. But the problem is that this new government, right, didn't have money. So they created these IOUs. Well, they did two things. First, they created these they were kind of like IOUs, but the first thing that they created was, what would be the word there? There's a name for them in fundraising where you buy them and they're only good in certain places. It's kind of like a gift certificate. So like this is entitles the bearer to $2, right? $2, but then it's not actual money. And instead, it was the idea that you could, certain merchants and stores would accept that certificate. And then and for the Revolutionary War, it's a big if they win, then when the war is over, the government will give them the money plus some interest for all those IOUs. So it's like a gift certificate and an IOU at once. So they're paying them in not real money. They're paying them in this money, this certificate that if it worked how it was supposed to, they could still use like money to go buy the supplies they needed. And then if they had any left over, they could turn that in for actual money plus interest after the war if they won. The problem is that the beginning of the Revolutionary War, the Continental Army wasn't doing so hot. And so most merchants wouldn't accept it because they're like, we're just never going to get this. We're never going to see this money. This is a piece of paper that is going to be worthless because you guys aren't going to win, basically. And so many soldiers, out of desperation, actually sold these certificates for pennies on the dollar to wealthy speculators or what would be like kind of like stockbrokers. Essentially, they were taking a gamble, but they were wealthy and they had the money to do so, and they bought these literally on pennies on the dollar. And then when the Revolutionary War ended and they did win, they made bank on these because they got the money, the full value plus interest, and they paid a few cents for each one of these certificates. And the poor soldiers got screwed out of that process. But during the actual war, then the problem is that they didn't have any actual money. They weren't getting actual money paid to them to be able to buy the goods that the military didn't provide. So for women to raise, this is why they were raising money for them. Because they're like, look, you're giving them IOUs that they can't use. We're going to raise some money so that we can give it directly to the soldiers. It was something that was needed. But it got rejected by George Washington, who wanted to have control over that. So instead, they took the money and put it into a warehouse and bought food and goods and gave those to the soldiers because they wanted to keep control. And I think that's an important part of it, is to show just like how much like women were not only involved, but they felt they had a right to have control over where this stuff went and how it was distributed. They didn't defer. She didn't defer to her husband. They didn't defer to George Washington. Instead, they said, fine, you're not going to let us decide? Well, then we're not giving you the money. You just forget that. And we're going to do it our way that allows us to have control. And they wanted to hold on to control for that. But the fundraisers weren't just some fluff fundraiser. This was an essential part of helping the Continental Army survive. And while they didn't get the money, the food was the important part from that helped them survive. They also made clothing because it was an issue where these soldiers were in rags, essentially, because they didn't know how to sew and patch their own stuff. They had no money to buy new stuff. And so they knit sweaters and socks, which were two big things. Sweaters for keeping warm, and socks, because socks were a huge thing that wore out quickly and were needed. They also made blankets as well. And then they actually like embroidered on a tag on the sweaters the name of the woman who made the sweater. And then they gave these to the soldiers as well. So this was essential like women, if women had not supported the Continental Army, the next one's going to be with the Continental Army as well. If women had not supported the Continental Army, it probably would not have been successful, because the men would have eventually just had to stop because they couldn't survive. And so it really was women that helped make the men stay in the Continental Army, which helped them win the war. The next one is camp followers. Camp followers were largely the poorer women. So while the fundraisers were wealthy women, poor women tended to be camp followers. There's going to be a middle group that weren't in the city and they weren't the elite, but they were well enough off that they stayed in the farm at home. Poor women who basically they could not survive with their husbands at war. Right, with the husband at war, especially because he was not getting any money that he could send home. They weren't wealthy enough to survive during that time period. So the women, it was women and children followed the Continental Army, but thus camp followers. And they camped. They usually camped with the actual camp, but then they stayed behind when there was an actual battle. So they weren't on like the front lines, especially if you had children. They stayed behind. We will talk about with actual fighting and when women as camp followers stepped up and actually helped in the actual battle itself. This was the camp followers provided a vital role. To, even though George Washington often complained about them, it did slow him down, because you have the bigger group that you have to move, the slower the mobilization. So yes, it did do that, but again, just like with the fundraisers, and probably even more so, the Continental Army would not have been successful. It would not have lasted without camp followers. A vital role in we'll say winning, I guess, the war. So why what was the vital role that they played? One, it was what you could argue, right? Emotional support with families. Having their wives and children there kept several of the men in the military. The thing with the military was the Continental Army vacillated between size and how many they had in the army. And not because of deaths with war. I mean, there was some of that. But it was more because men would go fight. And this happened in the militia too. But the militia were informal colonial militias. So each colony had their own militia. And those were way informal. You came and went as you needed. The war was won by both the militia and the Continental Army fighting against the British. The Continental Army was the official army. You signed up for it, but at the same time, if men got letters home from their wives saying the farm is failing and all these bad things are happening, they would leave and go home, and they would take care of that and make sure that their wife and children were okay before they came back. And so you had periods of time where the numbers were really small because men had to leave. So with these poorer families where the men would have never been able to stay because their wife and children wouldn't have survived without them, they were able to stay in the military because their wife and children went with them. And then on top of that, you get the emotional support of having your family there at the end of a battle, at the end of a long march, going to be able to go camp with your family. Really kept people in the military itself. The camp let's get back on that. The camp followers cooked and provided food for all of the men. So even if there were men that didn't have wives and or children that were camp followers. The camp follower women, they cooked for the army. Remember, the Continental Army did not provide food for the men. They were supposed to somehow go procure it, even though they didn't have money, and then were supposed to cook it and do all that stuff. Well, no, these camp followers went and bought the food or got food from the fundraisers, and they cooked and served meals to the men in the Continental Army. They also mended clothes, which, as we saw, was important with the fundraiser because that was something that often didn't get done. They helped, like I said, they helped keep the men from leaving the army. They cleaned the military hospitals and the camps, as well as also cleaned clothes. So this is important because it helped keep down on disease by keeping things clean. And the reality was, without the camp followers, a lot of the cleanliness would not have been there, and you would have had a higher rate of death by disease. They also were informal nurses. So women could not be nurses yet, which is why I wrote informal. Nursing was seen as a male job. But women as camp followers were looking for things to help do. And so they went into the military hospitals, and at first they just started cleaning because they were a disaster. And then from there, they provided nursing. So the medical part when needed. So if the nurses and doctors were short-staffed, they would then look to the camp follower women that were there and have them be an aid and help out. They also provided support to the men. And they did this by writing letters to family of the injured. They also were there for, we'll say, comfort to dying men. And those that were in pain. So they played an essential role, and this eventually is helped lead to women being official nurses. By the Civil War, women were now nurses. So, it became an acceptable job, not right off the bat, but because of what women did as camp followers, it became an acceptable job for women to be nurses officially, and that became an expanded, right, this kind of branch of what jobs can women do. Well, it's midwife at this point is about it, and then outside of the home, right, and then nursing is going to add to it. We'll see teachers, elementary school teachers, is going to be added to it as well, as long as it always can connect back to the domestic sphere. But during the Revolutionary War, men were seen as doctors and nurses, women were not, and it was because of the camp followers that became seen as a potentially acceptable role. And then some women ended up fighting for specific battles. Or I should also say, I suppose, helping out during the battles. We'll say, or helping during the fighting. You had one woman, Molly Pitcher, as she ended up being called, who would go around during the battles. Let's see. She would well, we'll keep her there. We'll just I'm going to talk a little bit more about the women in a minute, so I don't want to put her first. Let's just talk about what they did. So one woman, she helped, she went around and gave water to the men during the fight. Right? And she wasn't doing this like when they're like running and attacking, But the thing is you had a variety of positions, and further in the back lines, you had men on cannons, you had men, they would line up with the musket rifles, and you had to do this, it was like several steps. You had to rip open, and they had some in paper, they had some in tin little powder cans. And you had to put the powder into the gun. You had to then put the musket ball. Then you had to tamp it down. Then you had to have the wick, and you had to light the wick to fire. So it was this process, and they'd line up, and you'd have rows. And so the first row would shoot, and then they would lie down, or they'd already be lying down. Then the next row would shoot, and while there's next row shooting, the front row was then getting ready for a new musket ball. And then you'd have this order, and then in the back were those who were eventually moving up, and then others who would move to the back of the line. So she went around and gave people water, and it was hot, it was dirty. You would get the powder on your mouth, and so she was providing water for these men. Now, of course, like if they advanced forward and attacked, she wasn't running with them, handing them water. But when they're kind of in a more order position, and that was a dangerous thing. She could have gotten hit by an errant musket ball or one that was targeted. The musket balls were, because they were round, rather than like spiraling out of the chamber like a rifle bullet later that's developed, it didn't go straight. It kind of just zigzagged around everywhere, and it hit whatever it hit. They were not accurate. So this was a dangerous position. Other women were taught their husband's position, and not only helped during battle, but even and continued fighting if their husband fell. So there were a couple of cases. Husband was injured. So there were a couple of cases where, like one husband was, one gut man, he was on one of the cannons, and he taught his wife how to fire the cannon and how to aim and do all of that. And when he got shot, he didn't, for at least this one story, he didn't die, but he fell and he was taken to the hospital. She then took up his post and continued firing those cannons throughout the battle. So you had some that were continuous, like Molly Pitcher and one other woman did this where they're giving water. That was a continuous thing through multiple battles. And then you had others that were either continuous, like helping, so they would be there, or a single battle. So if they were just being an aid where they helped give whatever they needed to help them fire the cannons faster, there was someone that did that continuously. And then others, like when her husband fell, where she helped for that one particular battle, but she didn't take over completely. But there were things like this, where women who were, there was another couple women who helped move the injured to the hospital, right? And so they are putting themselves in danger and in the field where they could have been shot and killed. And so these are the most of the common ways that camp followers helped fight. And all of these roles, though, especially the fighting ones, were more unique. They're helpful, but all these other ways were the vital roles that were it was basically the supply chain of the military that is needed, that the military didn't provide, and again would not have been successful if they had not helped out. And then you had women who were fighters. Or we'll put soldiers. Women who were soldiers. There were some women who, so one was the camp followers, right? Where they were not disguised or anything like that, but they aided in the battle in some way or another, whether that was a continuous thing or a single battle, right? And then here, well, I guess I could have just put it up there, but here you have Molly Pitcher. Pitcher, there we go. That provided the water, right, for the battle and brought that. But then you also had women who dressed as men and enlisted as soldiers and fought. There were some women that were they wanted to help, and they felt this was the best way that they could help. Probably one of the most famous was Deborah Sampson, and she dressed up as a man and enlisted twice. And she enlisted twice because she was discovered one time and then went back. So she was discovered because she got injured. And she actually, so she was injured and then discovered, and then later enlisted in a different location as a new man. And right, they didn't have IDs back then, so it was easier. And apparently, if you just put on pants and cut your hair, you looked like a man. I mean, to me, it's always interesting how many women, there were several women that did this. And the only women who got caught were ones who, there was only one woman who got caught because they were suspicious that she was a woman. Everyone else got caught, that did get caught, because they were injured. And then in the hospital, when the doctor's cutting away the clothes, is like, oh, this is a woman. And there were plenty who never got discovered and just told their story later. So to me, that's crazy to think about. I was like, apparently it didn't take much back then to convince people they were men, because women didn't wear pants and their hair wasn't short. So even if he looks feminine, it must be a man. But there was one woman that apparently was too feminine. The way she walked and talked, the men got suspicious, and then she was accused, and then they had, prove you're a man, and then she was discovered. But Deborah Sampson, so she was enlisted, she fought, she was seen as like a great soldier. Under her male name that she enlisted in, the male names, it was given commendations for his fighting, his bravery, was seen as a great soldier. She got shot in the leg and then took out the bullet herself and tried to clean it so that she wouldn't get caught. It ended up getting infected with lead, the blood poisoning, and she passed out. They took her to the hospital, and then the doctor discovered that she was not a man. So then after she healed, she went to a different location and enlisted as another man and fought again for a while. This was one, they were recognized often by, so there's two parts to this. Let's say the local units often recognized these women. Talked about once they discovered that they were women, how brave they were, and how important they were in fighting, and how that they would have them any time as a fellow soldier. But as official soldiers, they were not recognized. They were denied veteran support. Deborah Sampson eventually got some, she continued pressing for, but they were denied veteran support because they were not said to be official soldiers. And technically, they risked jail for this because it was illegal. And so they could have been punished for this, for fighting as a woman. So it was a big risk. And these women were willing to fight and die for the cause, and so much so that they were willing to disguise themselves and perform minor little surgeries on themselves to not get caught. All of these women were very impressive, that did this way. It was a much smaller number than the fundraisers and the camp followers, but it still was an important thing. And they do it again in the Civil War. The women are basically like, screw that, I'm going to participate. I'm just going to dress up as a man and do this. And then the Civil War comes around and it's the same. Screw that, I want to be involved. This is important. And they dress up as a man and fight. So it didn't stop with the Revolutionary War. Women dressing up as men to enlist as soldiers continued on with the Civil War as well. It gets harder when you start having IDs and there's more recognition for it, so you don't see it like World War I, World War II. But in the earlier wars, you see over and over again that women are willing and go a long way to fight. And when asked why did they do that, they said, because I thought that it was important, I needed to be involved, and this is the way I thought I could help. So that women from the beginning had a desire to be involved in the politics of the Revolutionary War, the fighting of the Revolutionary War, and didn't see themselves as being other or pushed aside, but rather as an important part of this event in history. And then lastly, women also functioned sometimes as spies. There was both in this war and the Civil War women who were spies. One of the reasons why women were effective as spies is that women were less likely to be suspected as spies. So what this allowed them is that they were able to have more access to locations that men did not, without being questioned, right? You might have, they were more likely to be invited to British officers' parties, where if the men were not known as loyalists, they wouldn't be invited. But women, again, remember, why is this with that? Well, femme covert. And so the women didn't have their own political identity. That was the common kind of belief. And so that was why there was not a guard up towards these women, because it was easier to engage with the British and the Loyalists and not be suspected. It was easier to get invitations to these things and not be suspected, because women weren't supposed to have that political interest, even though obviously we've seen they do. And then they could get information from the officers, from the parties, and pass that back to the patriots. And like I said, less caught. Women were not patted down at checkpoints, so they could hide stuff. Essentially, if you just hide stuff in your dress or in your undergarments, the men weren't going to pat them down to see if they were hiding anything. Later, when they found out that women were actually active spies, they started putting women at checkpoints to pat the women down, because they realized this was a big flaw in the whole system, is that women were sneaking stuff through because it was improper for the men to pat them down. And so they actually started putting women in those checkpoints to check other women. But it shows you how much women were spies and how much they had an impact that the British started doing this. They also used female slaves as spies, because the slaves were around. The British slaves, I should say slaves/servants. It depended on the location. So the British maintained some of the former slaves as servants, and then others were still slaves for the loyalists. And so they were there serving British soldiers, loyalists, and things like that. And then they would pass on information. In fact, it was probably one of the best sources of information for the Patriots, was coming from these female slaves that were basically invisible in many ways to everyone present. They would talk secrets while they're serving them. They would know what was going on in the household because they were ignored other than when they were used for labor. And there were several different ways that they did this. They sewed messages in clothes that then they had delivered to people. you had to have some connections, because slaves did have some limitations on where they could go, but you sew it onto clothes and you hand the package to someone that worked with you, that then was freer to go and continue passing it on to the patriots. They also had secret ink. What was that? Invisible ink. Benjamin Franklin invented this. Was with an egg. And so they would you'd have often the children that were slaves that were freer to go and roam around, given a basket of eggs, and then say, go deliver it to this person who was working with them, who would then pass it on to whoever needed to in the spy ring. Benjamin Franklin figured out invisible ink, essentially with vinegar, that if you take a hard-boiled egg and you write in vinegar on the shell, that when you peel the shell, it looks like a normal egg. When you peel the shell, that you would see the writing on the egg. And they'd usually have some kind of indication of which eggs were like that, and there would be normal eggs. So if anyone inspected the eggs and they opened up and took an egg, it wouldn't have anything in it. And I suppose you could quickly eat the evidence if you needed to as well. It was an easy way of destroying the evidence in that part. So they played a very essential role. And so women as spies fed the Patriots a lot of information on the Loyalists throughout the Revolutionary War, and were very important in getting key information on troop whereabouts, plans for where they were going to attack next, that were instrumental in being successful, for helping the Patriots be successful in battles. So women were probably some of the most effective spies. There were obviously male spies too. The whole spy thing is super interesting. With Benjamin Franklin and George Washington they set up a spy ring. And it's really interesting how that worked. They had all these secret signals for when to meet, how you hung up. Oh, that would put that one too. So how you hung up your laundry would indicate if you were ready to meet. So if you didn't have someone that you could pass stuff off to, then when you were doing laundry, which was just seen as a normal job for women and slaves, and both, I put this under slaves, but some of the female spies that were not slaves did this as well, which is why I was separating the two. So she's just doing laundry. That's what women do. That's what slaves do, right? That's just normal job. But if you hung a certain type of clothing in a certain way, it was a signal for whoever was the handler, if you will, of the spy to know that they needed to meet. And that was just one of many different types of signals and tricks that they had. The sewing into clothing. There was also one with sewing it into hiding it in the rim of the cap on the inside. Because again, women were not searched until later in the war, when they realized that women were doing all of this stuff behind their backs. Okay, so that's how they helped in the actual war. Now I want to look at life during the war, the home front, if you will. So that was during the war, for the war. Let's do the home front and experiences and structure there. One of the biggest things for women, so women who didn't become camp followers or weren't wealthy enough that it didn't matter that their husband was gone, there was a huge population that fell under this practice called deputy husbands. And this could be for anyone, whether it was a farmer or a merchant or whatever, right? This was a specific title that had to be given. So it isn't just something we called it, right? The wife had to be given the title of deputy husband, and this was needed to run the farm, or we'll say business, right? So whether that's a store or any other business in place of their husband. I forgot to look at I just realized the Hannah Griffiths reading. So we'll look at that because we're going to look at Abigail Adams as well. So I'll just look at the sources at the end because I totally spaced. I was going to do it with the boycotts. And I realized I just spaced that one. So well, when I look at Abigail Adams and the letter to John Adams, then we'll look at that one as well. Depending on the timing, if I'm getting too long, I might have to do that in the next lecture. And that one might work too fine, is to just kind of have the sources, the primary sources, go with that. Okay, so the reason for this is significant with the name. The name is important, right? Because the title is that women were not allowed to own, right? You have femme covert. And women were not allowed to own businesses or run the farm and have specific legal authority over those things. So women could not own businesses or really manage legally the legal aspects, we'll say, because I mean they could be at the farm and just keep doing stuff. The legal aspects of a farm or business, right? So whether, like I said, that's purchasing certain things, paying employees, all of that kind of needed a legal backing for that. And so they created this official legal term that's broken up into two parts, right? You have deputy, and then you have husband. And the deputy was meant to be the temporary status, and also a helper, right? So the deputy is not the sheriff, they're the helper of the sheriff. And then the husband, right, which is the role of the male as head of the household. So you are a deputy, temporary helper, husband. And they have to give this male title officially to women so that they can run the business. And this allowed them then to be responsible for purchasing, selling, harvesting, paying employees, and all of that. But so it is interesting, right, that because of femme covert, it required this official title of deputy husband, and that they couldn't let women just run these things. They had to give it a male title in order for her to be able to do this. And many women had to become deputy husbands while their husbands were gone. And they continued the farm and the farm business. So not like if it was your own personal farm and you had no employees, you didn't need to become a deputy husband. You just lived on your house and your land and you farmed. But if you had a larger farm where you had to have purchasing and selling and harvesting and paying employees, and they were needed to be responsible for all that, then you had to become a deputy husband. Likewise, if you were a merchant and you were going to war, you needed your wife to be a deputy husband so she could run the business legally. And no one could come in and take it from her or abuse the system. It gave her the legal authority to control the employees, to have the authority to do whatever she needed to do to run the business. So the consequences of this were a couple things. And we see a variety of responses. Some women did very well and thrived. Other women did not. And, that's not surprising. There were a lot of difficult circumstances. One of the things that people did try to take advantage of women. So whether it was the employees or merchants, even with the official deputy husband title, you had people who were looking to take advantage of the women in those situations. You also had significant high price increases on goods because of the war. and women had to navigate how to be able to buy that and manage that. And in fact, women took a stand against price gouging by merchants. When merchants, so there was an expectation that prices would go higher because of the war. But if a merchant was price gouging an unreasonable amount, groups of women actually banded together and would sack the merchant's store as a warning to other merchants not to price gouge, because it was really life and death. This wasn't just some kind of petty thing for, clothing that they didn't need, or the latest, they didn't have gadgets really back then, but the latest thing that I just need that. No. This was for like food and sugar and other goods that were staples that were necessary for survival, and women were responsible for feeding their children. And so this was seen as an important thing to prevent, so that women could afford to survive during this time. And so women really did band together in these things, whether it was the boycotts or whether it was with the price gouging or other things like that. We also have letters that were sent, letters between husband and wife. And this actually shows us the evolution for some women. Again, now there were some that the business was failing, they couldn't get it to work, they were ready to go, they're like, I can't do this, and their husbands actually often came home to make sure that things didn't collapse. But there's other ones where we see in the early letters that the husbands give lots of detail and instructions, right? Understandably so. You have, if your wife hasn't done stuff with the business, then the other thing that we saw is there would be terms like your farm by the women, or your business, right? So when they were writing the letters to their husband, your farm is doing well. Your farm, your business is this is happening. As the war continued and women had been in the role of deputy husband for a while, the letters, these letters from these same people began to change, and it began to shift to our farm or business, right? And sometimes, although more rare, my farm, which shows women taking ownership of that and taking into that role. We also see in the later, so these are the later period, later letters. These are the earlier letters. Right, and then you see husbands went from, in the letters, from writing instructions to basically they stopped, we'll just say stopped telling the women, telling their wives what they needed to do. So they realized that their wives were capable, and they stopped providing instructions and kind of micromanaging right over the process. There was even a couple letters where the women basically stated, when the war is over, I want part of running the business. I want to be part of running the farm. I use farm as the example, but business too, right? Like basically one woman said, I hope you know that things are not going to go back to the way they were when this war is over. I expect to be part of running this business. I like it. I'm doing a good job. I want us to be partners in our business. So some just said, I don't want to give this up when the war is over. Some were more subtle, versus the one woman who was basically like, look here, this is gonna change when we get home. No more of me staying in the house. I'm gonna be helping run this business because I did a good job doing it, and this is my business too. So you have this shift in kind of identity and ownership of what they were able to do. Where are we? Let's see where we're at for time. Yeah, okay. There's more with the home front, but I think I need to stop or it's going to go really long. So we finished talking about the home front next time, and then looking at the end of with the war ending, how things change. And Republican motherhood. And then because I didn't look at the source, because I forgot to look at Hannah Griffiths, I think I'll probably start with that. On the next lecture, we'll go with Hannah Griffiths first, and then we'll look at Abigail Adams, which is kind of the next thing I was going to talk about, was political identity, and then violence and the war on the home front. And then Republican motherhood and education. So, sorry to break it up into two, but otherwise this is going to go into like probably 2.5 hours, and I want to try to keep it at 1:40-ish, or to 2 at the most. So yeah, we'll stop there. I will finish the rest. This is not the end. We're going to finish the rest in the next lecture.